Good afternoon, everyone, friends, faculty, staff of Duke Divinity School, visitors who we have with us. Welcome for this occasion. We're pleased today to have with us a distinguished visiting lecturer, Professor N.T. Wright. He is the former Bishop of Durham in the Church of England, and he is now Research Professor of New Testament and Early Christianity at the University of St. Andrews, Scotland. He's the author of many, many books. I'm not going to take any more time introducing him to you because I expect that would be superfluous for this crowd. We have a very limited window of time here today. He has another engagement at 1:30, and so we're going to whisk him away rather quickly at the end of this session. We do hope that there will be time for a few questions and answers after his lecture today. The lecture that he's giving to us today is Why and How Paul Invented Christian Theology. Tom, welcome to Duke Divinity School.
Thank you very much. It's always a delight to be here, and I'm especially grateful for the chance to say something about Paul yet again, and particularly to set out very briefly what is actually the main thesis of the book which I published this time last year, Paul and the Faithfulness of God. As not all reviewers have pointed out what the main thesis of the book actually is, I thought it might be a good idea just to let you know. So that's what you're getting today. Why and how Paul invented something which, with hindsight, we can call Christian theology. Two questions we must address right from the start. Introduction. First, what do I mean by this phrase, Christian theology? And second, what do I mean when I propose that Paul invented it? To the first, I am talking here primarily about an activity, a vocation, a task, an exercise, not, in other words, about the content of a dogmatic syllabus. I am arguing here, as in Paul and the Faithfulness of God, that Paul engaged in and reflected upon and did his best to inculcate in his hearers an activity which he believed was vital for the health and witness of the church. What he wanted was that followers of Jesus would, in principle, be learning to think in a new way. This is, of course, at the heart of what some today refer to with the word apocalyptic. Paul believed that in Jesus, Israel's Messiah, and supremely in his death and resurrection, Israel's God had unveiled his new creation. He believed that Jesus' followers were called to be part of that new creation, and that meant a new kind of thinking. The content of the thought, of course, mattered vitally, but learning to think in the new way mattered above all. And for Paul, this vocation, this activity, which I loosely call Christian theology, was load-bearing. Without it, the church would not be, could not be, what it was called to be. What was this new way? For Paul, it was a matter of learning to live within Israel's scriptures and the overall story which they told. The story which Paul believed had reached its telos, its goal, in Jesus, and had thereby exploded into new life. It was a matter of learning to pray in the Jewish way, now reworked around Jesus and the Spirit. It was a matter of learning to live intentionally in the new ways which had already been hinted at in the Scriptures, but were now made available to the larger company of Jews and non-Jews alike, who found themselves grasped by the gospel. What I'm here calling Christian theology, in inverted commas, is the activity of the whole church, thinking with renewed minds and hearts, thinking scripturally, prayerfully, communally, about who the one God is, who God's people are, and what God's future is for the world. Those are the topics which I have argued in the book are central to the content of what Paul is proposing, but I am here concentrating on the thinking itself. To call this Christian theology is, of course, anachronistic. Paul didn't call it that, and nor did anyone till, I think, at least the 3rd century. I might be wrong on that, but that's my guess. But my case is that in Paul we see the first beginnings, the first stirrings of an activity which grows and swells and becomes utterly characteristic of the Christian movement as we see it developing in subsequent centuries. The classic texts in which Paul outlines this task, this vocation, are well known. In Romans 12, taking a deep breath after the strenuous exposition of chapters 1 to 11, Paul appeals for a life of total dedication to God, the presentation of the whole self, of the body, in a new kind of living sacrifice. And then he says, "Do not be conformed to the present age, but be transformed by the renewal of your minds, so that you may discern and work out in practice what God's will is, what is good and acceptable and perfect." In other words, the new age had broken in, the age to come which was spoken of by apocalyptists and rabbis alike, and those who through the gospel found themselves caught up in this new age were called to a transformation of the mind, in other words, to a new kind of thinking. It's interesting that Paul has to tell them to be transformed. In other words, it doesn't happen automatically, a point to which I shall return. No doubt he would say that the gospel and the Spirit have done the basic groundwork, but the follower of Jesus has to be intentional about learning to think, not just to behave, in accordance with the new age. That is at the heart of Paul's inauguration of Christian theology. The letter to the Philippians offers a sustained account of the mind of the new community. I'll come back to this again, but for the moment I just note that the well-known, sometimes puzzling command in Philippians 2:5, "Have this mind among yourselves, which is yours in Messiah Jesus," if that's how to translate it, this command is a command to do theology in this sense, to think within the Christologically transformed new creation, the world over which the crucified Jesus already reigns as Lord. Other examples crowd in. You may be thinking of 2 Corinthians 5. Now a new sort of knowledge, because if anyone is in the Messiah, there is a new creation. And in 1 Corinthians 1 to 3, we find another sustained exposition of the new kind of thinking, which comes to focus in that breathtaking claim at the end of chapter 2, that we have the mind of the Messiah. What I'm referring to as the beginnings of Christian theology is precisely the cultivation, direction, and development of the Messiah's mind. My second introductory comment has to do with the claim that Paul invented something. One might hear this claim in terms of the older traditional Jesus and Paul debates. Was Paul the true founder of Christianity? And so on. Paul himself says that the foundation is Jesus himself, with apostles as people who build on the foundation. Ephesians 2 says something slightly different. That's beside my present point. When we see what Paul was trying to do in teaching the churches to think in the Messiah, to think within the new age, he both was and wasn't doing something Jesus had done before. Yes, Jesus challenged Peter to think not as humans think, but as God thinks. Yes, in Luke 24, Jesus opened the disciples' minds to understand the Scriptures. Yes, all those parables, Jesus was constantly trying to get his hearers to think differently about the kingdom of God. There are many continuities there with the tasks Paul set himself, but I think Paul was still doing something substantially new. The newness of his task relates directly to his consciousness of the vocation to be the apostle to the Gentiles, to be the one who would take the play which Jesus had written and would direct a large and diverse cast of actors in staging its production. The task Paul had in mind was likewise in continuity with and in discontinuity with the Jewish world of his birth and upbringing. The Jewish world knew many debates on many topics. Mostly they were not about who God was or who God's people were. Those were more or less taken for granted. And the ongoing debates which Jews had about how God was going to bring his purposes to completion was as much a political as a theological topic. Jews to this day have commented that Jews do not normally do theology in the way that Christians do. They can ask and answer theological questions, but theology as a task has never been seen as load-bearing within the Jewish communities, in the way it is and has been from the start within Christian communities. So, one might ask, was Paul's sense then of this new task a matter of leaving behind the Jewish world where people didn't do that sort of thing, and instead undertaking an alien or Gentile activity? Not at all. The Greek world knew the word theologia, but in Aristotle and elsewhere this refers to one sub-branch of physics, the study of whatever there is in nature, physis. Cicero's book on the nature of the gods and other similar works were again not load-bearing. One could reflect on such topics without the reflection itself or the results one reached being of foundational or structural importance for one's community or daily living. But for Paul, the one God was not part of the world of physis, nature. He was its creator and Lord. Paul could address the issues of physics and the two other ancient divisions of philosophy, ethics and logic, but in all cases he transformed them in a decidedly Jewish direction, though doing things which no Jews had done before. And it begins to look, at least from this preliminary quick sketch, as though the task that I'm calling Christian theology, as undertaken by Paul and urged on his hearers, was yet one more symptom of his belief that the people of God, as redefined in and around Messiah and Spirit, were very Jewish when seen from a non-Jewish point of view, and yet also thoroughly transformed. Paul would have said that this transformation had to do with the new age which, for many, perhaps most Jews of his day, had longed, and which he believed had been inaugurated by Jesus. So, though you could say that Paul was picking up this task from Jesus himself, Paul was engaging in it in a new way. Jesus had not tried to generate and sustain a Jew plus Gentile community. He had not, as Paul said he was doing, been taking every thought captive from the wider Gentile world to obey the Messiah. Paul was implementing something which Jesus had accomplished. And I'm suggesting that part of that implementation was precisely the developing and urging of this activity of learning to think in the Messiah. It is, of course, possible, my last note within my introduction here, that there were great teachers of theology in the church before Paul. I don't regard that as likely. They haven't left us any imprints. True, if the poems in Philippians 2 or Colossians 1 were pre-Pauline, then somebody with remarkable theological insight and linguistic versatility penned them very early. But we don't know that. And actually the use Paul makes of those poems is more explicit again in terms of teaching people to think in the new way. Anyway, with these introductory comments, I move to my two central questions. If this is what I mean by Christian theology, why did Paul invent it, and how did he do so? So why? The central argument of my book is that Paul invented and developed both the task of Christian theology and its particular content to meet specific and pressing needs in the early church. We don't find parallel movements in either the Jewish or the non-Jewish world of his day. These were new tasks. My main argument goes like this. In almost every letter, we can see Paul urging two things upon his churches: unity and holiness. Paul is well known for the doctrine of justification, but whereas there are 3 and a bit passages in Paul which deal with that, there are dozens of appeals for unity and holiness. The post-Reformation churches have caused some headaches here, partly because the Reformation generated radical disunities which were accepted as part of the price of recovering the gospel, and partly because the emphasis on justification by faith often meant a de-emphasis on holiness, lest the pure faith be corrupted with works. But unity and holiness were central for Paul. But how do you get there? How do you achieve them? Unity and holiness are difficult. In combination, they often seem impossible. It's relatively easy to work for unity if you don't care about holiness. You just adopt an anything-goes strategy. And it's comparatively easy to work for holiness if you don't care about unity. You just go on splitting the church over every disagreement. The trick is to get both at the same time. How can that be done? My Pauline answer is that you do it by teaching people to think Christianly, teaching them Christian theology as a task, as a vocation, as an assignment. Only if and when they're doing that will true holiness or unity be even thinkable. But once they have been thought as part of that new mind, new creation thinking process, then they might just become a reality. After all, let's be clear, Paul was not trying to provide doctrine and ethics for every occasion. He does not cover every topic. He is writing on the principle, give someone a fish and you feed them for a day, teach someone to fish and you feed them for life. Paul could give specific instructions when they were urgently needed, but most of the time he's trying to teach his hearers the difficult art of the new age mental transformation, the renewed mind. He wrote in Colossians 3 that the new humanity is being renewed in knowledge according to the Creator's image. That was Paul's aim. He would put up signposts to show the direction of travel, but then it was up to his communities to go down the road in a settled and sustained act of theologically informed choice and will. After all, Paul couldn't possibly say everything in each letter. The letters must represent not only miracles of composition, but in parallel, miracles of omission. There must have been many things he longed to say to them, for which there just wasn't space and time. And in any case, it wouldn't have made sense, even had it been practicable, for Paul to provide a first-century version of Aquinas' Summa Theologica plus a similarly scaled work covering all possible ethical dilemmas. After all, that would have resulted in a church where all you had to do was to go to the shelf, pull off the relevant volume, and look up the answer. Paul's aim was quite different. Of course, that is what some Christians wish the Bible was and how they sometimes want to treat it. Paul's letters, like all the scriptures, aren't doing that. They're saying, here's where you start, this is the direction of travel, learn to think differently and figure out the route. Paul is challenging his hearers to think theologically, to do Christian theology as the shared task, the scriptural, prayerful task through which they will grow up into a maturity of thinking and hence of everything else as well. There's an excellent example of this in Philippians 2, which I've already mentioned. Philippians 2, 1 to 18, take it as a whole. The command in verse 5, tuto phronite en humin hokai en Christo Jesu, holds together the introductory exhortation to unity in 1 to 4 and the remarkable poem of 6 to 11. How can one possibly obey those commands in Philippians 2, 1 to 4? It's a high-as-the-sky demand of unity, thinking the same thing, being in full accord and of one mind. Anyone who's lived in the church for 5 minutes knows how difficult that is. Trust me, I'm a bishop. Paul's answer is you can only do it through the mind of the Messiah. Humility and self-abandoning love is the only way to go. But this needs to be worked out in 1,000 situations for which Paul cannot possibly give precise instructions, which is why he says in 2:12 to 13 that they must work out their own salvation in fear and trembling, because the one who is at work in them is God, to do his good pleasure, to will and to do his good pleasure. What is this working out of salvation? Despite generations of anxious post-Reformation readers, when Paul says work out your own salvation, this has nothing to do with a moralistic contribution to one's own grace-given salvation. That's not what he's talking about. His point is this: in the Messiah, you have been given a salvation, a soteria, That comes from the Isaianic tradition reflected in chapter 2, but it goes way beyond anything thought of before Jesus, and it confronts the imperial propaganda which offered to Rome's subjects and to Caesar's devotees a salvation which functioned effectively as a global protection racket. Paul did not have time in Philippi to teach the new church any details about what their kind of salvation would mean in practice. He had set them a personal example, as he refers to in chapter 4, verse 9, what they had learned and received and heard and seen in him. That's how they were to do stuff. But they faced many other issues, and for all of them, they had to learn to think for themselves, to think in the Messiah, and to engage in what, with hindsight, we could call Christian theology as the task of the whole church. Philippians 2 continues in verses 14 to 18 with one of Paul's sharpest exhortations to holiness. The community is to live as resurrection people within the as yet unrenewed world. Paul echoes Daniel 12 and says that they are to shine like lights in a dark world. That's as close as he comes anywhere, actually, to talking about the, at least implicit, evangelistic witness of the whole church. That's another point. But the whole longer paragraph, 2:1 to 18, consists both of a sustained exhortation to unity, verses 1 to 4, and holiness, verses 14 to 18, and as its center and driving heart, the dense expression of theology, scripture-soaked, prayerful, Messiah-centered, cross-centered, which provided the pattern for the unity and the energy for the holiness. The Christ poem, in other words, is not a detached piece of theological poetry. I don't know whether it was written by Paul himself or somebody else beforehand, or by Paul himself actually maybe while writing this very letter. We just don't know that. But I do know that as it stands, it serves exactly this double purpose. If you want to generate and sustain unity and holiness, learn to think with the mind of the Messiah. Back to the example from Romans 12, which makes the same point. Immediately after the opening flourish about being transformed by the renewing of the mind, Paul launches into one of his variations on the theme of the church as the body of Christ. Here, the one body in the Messiah. That's the theme of unity, and from there he goes straight into the beginning of the ground rules for Christian living. Part of my point is that he knows it's no good just giving people rules. The rules make little or no sense within the old world. Just as the resurrection of Jesus makes no sense in the old world. So many debates about the resurrection of Jesus, in your country particularly, where people try to do rationalist apologetics or rationalist counter-apologetics, is as though you were trying to fit the resurrection into the old world. It can't be done. The resurrection is the beginning of the new world. The shock of that is that it's not a different world, it's the transformation of the old world from within. Unity and holiness are just the same. They make no sense within the old world. They're actually nonsense. Why would you try to do that? But they are the hallmarks of the new world, which has begun with Jesus' resurrection and in the power of the Spirit. And that's why, if people are to live appropriately in the in-between times, the now and not yet times, they must be transformed by the renewal of the mind. And again, the point is, this doesn't happen automatically. Part of the aim is that the messianic and spirit-driven new humanity is precisely renewed humanity, with the mind renewed to be fully awake and to take responsibility. God wants people, not puppets. Two key passages in 1 Corinthians exemplify the same framework. 1 Corinthians 1 to 3, Paul deals with personality cults, and underneath this he discerns different kinds of wisdom, the wisdom of the world and the hidden wisdom revealed in the gospel. The gospel is the message of the crucified and risen Jesus, a scandal to Jews, folly to Gentiles, but to those who are being saved, the messianic power and wisdom of God. And Christian theology, developed in the service of church unity, is about embracing the foolishness of God, which is wiser than human wisdom, and being held firmly in place by the weakness of God, which is stronger than human strength. Paul is teaching the church to think Christianly. And not only so, but to think about thinking Christianly, to reflect on what it is that they are now being required to do, to think their way round the fact that there is a new form of wisdom to be dispensed among the mature. And then a few chapters later, Paul has a sustained piece of theological or meta-theological teaching. He is in 1 Corinthians 8 to 10, he is mounting an argument about meat offered to idols. And what he's doing is teaching the church to think theologically, again, in order to fund the ecclesial vocations of unity and holiness. Unity because if some Christians think it's okay to eat idol meat and others don't, we're pretty soon going to have a serious and sharp division. But simultaneously, holiness, if Christians who agree with Paul that idols don't exist, therefore you can eat the food that's offered to them, well, then they may decide that they'll find their way back into the idol temples and into the amoral subculture that goes with them. And that will be the kiss of death to their baptismal profession and the consequent vocation to holiness. And this is the context for some of Paul's most dramatic theological teaching. But again, my point is as much about his inculcating of the habit of thinking Christianly as it is about any particular dogmatic innovations. I've elsewhere highlighted in chapter 9 of the book Paul's rewriting of the Jewish prayer, the Shema, in 1 Corinthians 8:6. But I mention that here to remind us that Paul's very Jewish and yet very much reworked theology is about the life of prayer, which for the Jew meant, among other things, the regular recitation of the Shema, sometimes referred to by later rabbis in terms of taking upon oneself the yoke of the kingdom. Paul expounds the present and future kingdom later in chapter 15, and chapters 8 to 10 contribute to this dramatically, insisting upon the sovereign rule of the one God over the whole world, not least the world of idols. And the peroration of this section, 1 Corinthians 10:23 to 11:1, focuses on Psalm 24, verse 1, one of the great scriptural statements of the unique kingship of Israel's God. This, starting with the Shema and finishing with Psalm 24, that's how 1 Corinthians 8 to 10 is framed scripturally. Paul is teaching his hearers to think as kingdom of God people who live within the scriptural and prayerful world in which there is one God to whom all things belong. And at the same time, with his Christological reworking of the Shema, he is teaching them to think as Messiah-shaped kingdom people. That is, to allow the fact of the Messiah's cross and resurrection to reshape not only their reflection on what they should do, but their reflection on the communal context in which they do it. And with these theological tools, Paul is showing them how to navigate the choppy waters between the Scylla of a dualistic rejection of the world and the Charybdis of an uncritical embrace of it. Eat the meat, yes, if you know why, but don't go into idol temples and don't engage in the practices normally associated with them. But these are not just rules dumped on them from a great height with a take it or leave it. Those are the results of teaching them to think theologically. Another example is the little letter to Philemon. I'm not going to take any time over this. The first chapter of the book, I go into it in detail. But the point is that Paul is teaching Philemon to think in the Messiah and to work out for himself what he must do, which is one reason why some exegetes have found it difficult to see what Paul is asking him to do. Because the main thing is Paul is nudging him into thinking Christianly so that Philemon will himself realize what he has to do. So my first main point then is that if Paul has invented something which with hindsight we can call Christian theology, we can see that this is why he has done it, to sustain the church as the united and holy people of God, which can only be brought about through the transformation of the mind. So, my second main point, how did he set about doing this? In one sense, of course, the writing of the letters is itself the answer to the how question. The letters are demanding, as we know, intellectually, spiritually, culturally. People often ask me, how did Paul expect his hearers to understand all that dense material straight off, especially if they didn't know Israel's scriptures like he did? The answer is, well, there were teachers in the early church, and one must assume that one of their main tasks was to teach the scriptures. We may also assume that whoever carried the letter would be the probable first reader and the probable first expositor. Someone who had been with Paul when he dictated the letter might be assumed to know what he was talking about. And I suspect that the letters would be read again and again, the shorter ones perhaps 2 or 3 times on the first day. And they would form in themselves a challenge to the community to grasp new things, to think in new ways, to get their minds round what Paul was doing in this explosive little letter which they just received. And not least, to go beyond the specific issues discussed and to think outwards into new areas of life which weren't covered in the letters, but to which the same kind of teaching needed to be applied. That, I've suggested, was Paul's aim throughout. But there are certain specifics as to the how. Let's explore a bit more what Paul meant by wanting them to think prayerfully. The prayer in question being anchored in the praying life of Israel. I've already mentioned the Shema, quoted and adapted by Paul in 1 Corinthians 8. But Paul wanted the early church to think particularly as people who prayed the Psalms. Again and again we find Paul expressing the Psalms as having a new focus on Jesus. Psalms 2, 8, 44, 110 come to mind, and several others as well, not least those cited as the suffering Psalms, like 69 and so on. But then in one of the most spectacular prayer-soaked writings from the first century, there is the letter to the Ephesians. I've said elsewhere that I regard the usually unargued prejudice against Ephesians as an unfortunate hangover from 19th century liberal Protestantism. It's strange, there aren't very many 19th century liberal Protestants around, and yet we still maintain their particular point of view. But whether or not you agree with what I'm saying, we are clearly dealing with someone very early who knew Paul and his writings well and was channeling his thought quite effectively, and might even have had the same name. Anyway, the whole of the first half of Ephesians, chapters 1 to 3, is held in place by praise and prayer. It begins with the great barakah, the great Jewish-style blessing, blessed be the God who, goes on from verses 3 to 14 of chapter 1. Praising God for his mighty acts in creation and in Exodus-style redemption. And it continues with the prayer for the church, that the church will know who the church really is. And then chapters 1 to 3 ends with that long summary of Paul's prayer that the church will know the Messiah's unknowable love and be filled with the divine fullness. And chapters 1 to 3 center upon the image of the church as the new temple, united in worship and common life through the dramatic redeeming action of God in the Messiah. There is a wonderful overall symmetry about chapters 1 to 3, which I think is then reflected in one of the central verses, chapter 2, verse 10, autou ga esmen poema. We are God's poem, God's artwork, poised between worship and intercession, forming the new temple in which Jew and Gentile come together in the Messiah. The vision of a theologically reflective community is held in place by the vocation to embody the creative artwork of the true God. If for Paul the how of theology had to do with prayer, the obvious companion theme is that for him the inculcation of theology as the central and centering action of the church was scriptural. He saw Israel's scriptures as a continuous and continuing narrative, shot through, of course, with patterns and types and images and models, but as a whole, far more than that, as a single story which he believed had reached its telos in the Messiah. As I said last night, Josephus, commenting on Deuteronomy 32, said that Moses was prophesying about things that would happen and that were happening in Josephus's own day. In other words, the Pentateuch is not just the backstory of Israel, but through prophecy summarizes the whole story. So Paul is again and again narrating his hearers into the story of Israel, declaring triumphantly that the Messiah is indeed the telos of the Torah, and going on to prove it by quoting exactly Deuteronomy 30 and 32. And this is one of the things I mean when I say that Paul is teaching his churches to think Christianly. They are to understand themselves as those upon whom the ends of the ages had come. The moment when God's age-old secret plan was finally revealed in all its shocking splendor. That's clear in 1 Corinthians 10:11, which I just quoted, but it's alluded to frequently, not least in Romans and Galatians, where the promises to Abraham have now come true in the Messiah, promises about the family and the inheritance, promises which evoke the pistis, the faith or faithfulness, which is the badge of the community. The Christian theology which Paul was inventing, and which, as an activity, he was eager to inculcate, was about learning to think and live within this narrative rather than some other. God had acted shockingly, surprisingly, world-transformingly, as he always said he would. The apocalyptic moment is not, of course, the result of a steady process of evolution, step-by-step progressive revelation, something like that. That's a 19th century aberration. But nor is the apocalyptic moment a total novum or a creatio ex nihilo. It is the result of the dramatic fulfillment of ancient promises, and within that, the fulfillment of hopes many times deferred, but still pondered and even calculated. Ancient Jewish apocalyptic literature contains many symbolic prophecies of many bad things that are going to happen in a sequence, after which the new age will dawn. It is anything but a long, slow journey up into the light, but as one can imagine Rabbi Akiba saying of Bar Kokhba in the 130s AD, and mutatis mutandis, the supporters of other would-be messiahs of the period, it must be possible to say that the time had fully come, which is what Paul says of Jesus in Galatians 4:4. Paul's method of inculcating Christian theology as a task was then to get his hearers to think as praying, scripture-soaked people, invoking the God of Israel now made known in and as Jesus the Messiah, and in and through the Spirit, and narrating the story of Israel as having found its telos in the same way. The scandal of the cross was not that it denied any sense of a Jewish story, but that the sense that it made within that story was shattering and radical, just as one might have expected, generating fresh fulfillments, not least the long-awaited messianic theme from the Psalms and Isaiah, in which Israel's coming king would bring justice and hope to all the nations. If you cut off the Israel roots of this, then the all the nations fruits of it aren't going to do what they ought to do. But Paul's inculcation of Christian theology was not only related to his sense of Israel's traditions of prayer and story, it also engaged by implication, but I think strongly, with his non-Jewish world. Paul was, after all, the apostle to the Gentiles, not primarily to the Jews. When in 2 Corinthians 10 he speaks of taking every thought captive to obey the Messiah, that looks to me like a statement of theological method. It ought to be possible in principle to ask how that method worked out, after all. One of the dangers, both with the so-called salvation historical reading of Paul and with the so-called apocalyptic reading, is that one ends up with a private narrative, an enclosed world. God does the new thing, whatever it is, which generates a new, strange form of existence without visible contact with what went before. The old has passed away and everything has become new, and from that point of view, Paul might be read in line with some readings of the early Bart. It's a wonderful building if you're already inside, but if you're standing outside, it's not obvious where you might find the front door. But that was not Paul's way. For him, the new creation was new creation. When he speaks of the renewal of the whole created order in Romans 8, or of God being all in 1 Corinthians 15, or of course in Colossians 1 of the Messiah being the one in and through and for whom all things were created, he is expressing the characteristically Jewish belief that Israel's God is the God of the whole creation, rethought around the belief that in the Messiah this same God has addressed and redeemed this whole creation. So, when we imagine Paul engaging with the philosophical traditions of his day, this would never be a matter of saying, in effect, that everything the philosophers had thought was wrong and they should just leave it all and embrace something totally different. Of course, there are times when a note like that has to be struck. Paul declares that his past privileges were so much scubala, trash, and he wants his Philippian hearers to say the same about theirs, but then in the next breath, he can tell them to think about whatever is true and noble and honourable and of good report. The Creator has not left himself without witness in the creation. Part of the how of Paul's theological project has to do with the constant implicit engagement with the pagan world of late antiquity. How did that work out? I've written this up particularly in chapter 14 of Paul and the Faithfulness of God. Let me just make one or two short statements about that. In that ancient world, as we know, there were three divisions of thought: physics, what there is; ethics, how to behave; and logic, how to know things, or how to reason from the known to the unknown. And these go together. Ethics is the behavior which makes sense in the world we describe in physics. Logic is about the true knowledge of that world. For Paul, these were signposts. To understand the new creation, it's no bad thing to understand the old one. But for Paul, the new world had come to birth in the resurrection of the Messiah, and his new immortal physical body, animated by the Spirit, was the prototype of the whole new creation. That's part of the point of Romans 8. For Paul, in other words, there was a new physics. The new world had come to birth in Jesus. There was a new ethic, which consisted in the behavior which makes sense within that new world. And there was a new knowing, as I've already said, in which was what happened when the mind was transformed so as to grasp the new reality. But the new physics was the transformation of this present world, not the creation of a new one ex nihilo. The ethic was the transformed living within the present world, not a detached or isolated way of life shielded from that world. And the new knowing was a matter of believing and discerning that the new had already broken into the old, like the morning star shining when the night seemed still dark. So to my conclusion. My case is before you. Paul invented Christian theology because only when the church is engaging in this task is there any hope of those elusive but mandatory virtues, unity and holiness. The task of reflecting about God and God's people and God's future was load-bearing for the new community in a way which was not true either of non-Christian Jewish reflection or of non-Jewish theories about the gods. And the way Paul invented this task was by teaching people to think prayerfully with the Jewish prayer tradition reworked around Jesus and Spirit, and to think scripturally with the scriptural narrative likewise reconfigured. And what I've tried to do today is to insist that none of this makes sense within the old age. Eschatology is all. These truths are the wisdom which you only see in the light of the divine glory revealed in Jesus. And Paul is clear that that glory does indeed and will indeed fill the whole earth. This is not a private revelation, it's for all creation. One quick final example and one quick final comment. In Romans 9 to 11, whatever we say about the contested meaning of the end of chapter 11, we must say a couple of things about the passage as an example of how Paul wanted people to think. Romans 9 to 11 opens and closes with prayer, but like several psalms, it opens with lament and closes with praise, with intercession held in place in the middle. This cannot be accidental. Second, he is obviously expounding Scripture, moving from Abraham through to Deuteronomy, expounding the Torah indeed, and then thinking messianically about what was to happen next. And third, as he does so, his final shout of praise from him and through him and to him are all things actually echoes phrases which you might hear in the dominant Stoic culture of his day. At the very moment when Paul is being most Jewish, he is articulating but upstaging the hope of the wider world. The Jewish vision of new creation, properly thought through in Messiah and Spirit, is the foundation for creative engagement with the wider world. This exactly exemplifies the new discipline of Christian theology which Paul is inculcating. One final comment. As I've said, in Paul's writing, we often find passages which scholars have deemed poetic. It's hard to know what sort of poetry they are, but they are clearly set in a higher register, with symmetry and assonance and many signs of careful composition. We can't tell whether Paul composed these himself, but one does not simply add a poem to a dense and careful argument, like someone bringing home a souvenir, a Chinese jar, and simply sticking it randomly on a shelf. It must belong. I wonder if perhaps Paul saw these poems as themselves signs of new creation, embodying the principle I mentioned a moment ago of the new emerging within the old as a foretaste of its eventual transformation. Part of his modelling something that we might call Christian theology could be the possibility that even the writing itself might hint at new beauty emerging from standard forms. After all, there's no good reason why St. Paul should not have done what many other writers do, hiding a verse within his supple prose, weaving the formal and the common words into a sleeping tableau. There it lies, still and still moving, waiting for the breath, the reader's wakening voice. No mere appendage, a far-fetched foreign ornament, but whispering the truth that new creation's on the way. Autu ga esmen poema, his artwork, a poem doubled. Thus, beneath the flow of exhortation, argument, and prayer, we sense a hidden stirring. Words, 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 the dry bones waiting for the promised breath. Thank you.
So we have we have about 12 minutes or so for some questions and answers. Jonathan is in the back with a microphone for those of you who'd like to ask questions. I would ask that the questioners respect the short time we have and give us not speeches but concise questions. And Professor Wright will try to answer with equal concision.
Professor Wright. Oh.
Sorry, yeah.
My question is, what would you say is the meaning of righteousness in the Pentateuch? And is there an underlying logic to Paul's differentiated use of the term righteousness of God in his writings?
What a wonderful question. I don't know if you all heard that. What's the meaning of righteousness in the Pentateuch, and is there a differentiation in Paul's varied use? As I have said more than once, the Hebrew tzedek tzedakah root and the Greek dikaiosune root are like enormous ocean-going vessels into which all sorts of meanings have been packed through the centuries. And part of our difficulty is that we do not have any ships in our modern fleets of words which can carry anything like the same quantity of cargo, the same differentiated cargo. So it is difficult. We do not have words that will do this. That's why I, like others, have tried to bring out different flavors so that on the one hand, clearly the word has the root of right behavior, appropriate behavior, but it's also got a communal meaning, and the communal meaning seems in the Hebrew Scriptures to be particularly concerned with the covenant between God and Israel, and hence both the behavior that is appropriate within the covenant and the ways in which that covenant is established, ratified, and worked out. And it seems to me that Paul is able to draw in a very sophisticated way on those different resonances at different points. But to take it very much further would, I'm afraid, need an hour or two of exegesis of Romans and Galatians, which would be enormous fun, but for which we don't have time now. I'm sorry. Yeah. Hi, Joel.
Tom, thank you. It was very impressive. But I'm just a little bit confused about whether you were claiming that Paul invented Christian theology or that he invented theology in general. And it seemed to me that by your emphasis on how load-bearing the theological task is in Paul, in contrast to the way it is in Judaism, you were sort of implying that he invented theology. And I just wondered what you thought about people like the author of Wisdom of Solomon, Letter of Aristeas, or especially Philo of Alexandria, who so much influenced medieval theology through Origen. Weren't they all thinking theologically? Weren't they thinking about some of these same problems that Paul is thinking about, idolatry and how to respond to the pagan world? And weren't they also thinking biblically and scripturally and trying to bring the Scripture in conversation with their contemporary world? So how is what Paul was doing different from what they were doing?
Thank you. Yes, that's a terrific question, as one might have guessed. The distinctive, I really want to insist that I didn't say Paul invented theology, because there was already a task called theologia in the ancient world from Plato and Aristotle onwards. So that's why I differentiated it as Christian theology, and that also differentiates it from what's going on in Wisdom, in Aristeas, in Philo, etc. Because there is a parallel activity. I don't, however, see, and maybe this is the accident of post-135 Jewish worlds, I don't see within Mishnaic Judaism, Rabbinic Judaism, that sort of task which Wisdom or Philo or whoever were inculcating as becoming in any way load-bearing for the community, this fresh exploration which you do find in Wisdom. In fact, it seems to me Paul is as much the heir of wisdom as anything in, say, the 3rd or 4th century Jewish world could be. And it's interesting that you say precisely it's Origen who's picking up stuff from Philo rather than much later Jewish writers. And where you do get, in the Middle Ages, Maimonides and people trying to do a fresh theological task, it never settles down and becomes foundational, and to use the word again, load-bearing, for their communities in the way that what Paul begins and John continues and lots of other people do later become, so that you then have this puzzle later on through to today, where if Christians ask Jews, what's your theology of this? Many Jews will respond, we don't actually do theology in the way that you do. And I think what I've tried to discern is why that is, that they're different sorts of community needing different sorts of activity. But certainly within the Jewish world, I think Paul would be quite happy to say that he was doing in Christ and the Spirit something like what Wisdom, say, was doing, but the Christ and Spirit thing is not just icing on the cake, it's actually part of the reshaping itself. So thank you. In a fuller version of this, I would love to write a few paragraphs engaging further with that. Time for a couple more? There's one there. Let's start there, since that's where the microphone is, and then come up here. Yes.
So where there is not overlap between Paul and the Gospels, do you think that he has the same truth claim status as the Gospels, or that he was doing something, an ad hoc solution to get people thinking about Christ, and that we need to do different things, responding to a different society to get people thinking about the Gospels today?
Yeah, I mean, the question of the relation of Paul and the Gospels is obviously not simple, because on most accounts the line goes from Jesus himself through to the very early church where we find Paul, and then, as maybe later, we don't actually know that for sure, the writing of these particular stories in these particular ways. But as I and many others have argued, what you see in the writing of Matthew, Mark, Luke and John, and any putative sources which might or might not lie behind them, is precisely a reflection messianically both on Israel's traditions as having found a strange and unexpected new fulfillment in Jesus, his kingdom announcement, his death and resurrection, etc., and on that story as the foundation of a new kind of community. You see all of that going on in the Gospels, and it is quite a complicated overlayering of different narratives that are going on focused on the story of Jesus. It seems to me that is one narratival way of doing something which is really rather like what Paul is doing, teaching people to think within this great story, to think prayerfully and scripturally within it, in order to be the people of God in the new situation. So that what the Gospels are doing is talking about Jesus in one way, Paul is doing it in another way, but they're all trying to sustain the life of this new community which must now live within this new story. And what I've tried to suggest is yes, that this is a pointer to Christian theology as an activity which the church must engage in every age, engaging with its wider culture, with its wider world, in ways that I've just tried to hint at, not in order to say, therefore, we can leave them behind and do something differently, but in order that we can be true to the original nature of that task, which is precisely to include the fresh engagements with fresh cultural issues and expressions. So it's got to be an easy commerce of the old and new. Oh, okay. Any other questions, or are we good to go? Oh, there's one here. Yeah.
Speak quickly. Would you perceive a sequence not only in how you would articulate how to think Christianly from monotheism to Messiah and then also to Spirit? Obviously, you have to communicate it sequentially. But for the Christian, with the new creation logic, can you step into thinking Christianly with a sort of simultaneous step into thinking about the world monotheistically, also through the Messiah, also with the Holy Spirit? Obviously, I'm reading your book on it right now, but I thought I'd go ahead and ask the question.
It's a huge question. There's so much going on there, I'm not quite sure. Sorry, can you just hang on to the microphone and just try and summarize the question? Because we have the Trinity, we have creation, we have Paul, and we have 1 minute.
I guess as a Christian, or coming to it from a post-the-resurrection perspective, I've often wondered how to approach explaining or even thinking about the idea of God. Do I step towards that through, like, honestly, I immediately step and I start to think about Jesus and I find the God that is represented there?
I think Paul would say absolutely. In order to discern and articulate who God really is, you have to be talking about Jesus, and you have to do so not necessarily talking about the Spirit, but invoking the Spirit in order to talk about Jesus, in order to make sense about God. And by doing so, since this God is, ex hypothesi, the creator of the world, this ought to be engaging in surprising and fresh and challenging ways with the wider world. I think from Philippians 2:1-18, just to take that, Paul would say that actually it is a matter of articulating, but it is also a matter of the church being the church as this extraordinary united community, the like of which no one had ever seen before, and as the church as the holy community, again, the like of which no one had ever seen before, which is why I've tried to stress in chapter 6 of my book that for Paul, the church itself is the symbol that people might see on the street that says, a la Ephesians 3, that we're challenging the principalities and powers because there is now a new sort of reality let loose in the world. That is a huge challenge to my church, your church, anybody's church. But that's the challenge which can only then be sustained by this serious, ongoing theological activity. Thank you.
Tom, we thank you for this stimulating lecture with its challenge for what it might mean for all of us to learn to take up the task of theology, of thinking Christianly in the world we face. Those of you who'd like to continue thinking with N.T. Wright along these lines should be advised that a number of his books are available in our bookstore at the other end of this hallway beyond the cafe. As I said, we have to whisk him away to his next commitment here this afternoon, but let's thank Tom one more time for this wonderful lecture.